Hello, History 103. I hope you're doing well. I'm recording this on a Friday, so I know it's a little bit later in the week than I normally would post some. So for today, this is the last video lecture of the semester. As you know, I've emailed you all about the grading schema that I'm offering you, so I'm not going to go over that in detail again. If you have any questions, just email me and I'll clear them up for you. But the requirement that I have is that you, through this week and into next week, watch this last video and then respond to a discussion prompt, which I will email you about by next week. So as of next Wednesday, which is the 20th, all of your work for this class will be done, as would have been the case anyway, had we had a normal semester. So this is the again final video lecture for this semester, and the subject of the lecture is the Civil War, and the Civil War, which will correspond for you to chapter 14 in American Yop. And if you want to pause for a second, pull that up. There will be some images that I'll refer to over the course of this talk. Is the Civil War itself is of course, perhaps, and I think likely, the most significant event in American history. One that fundamentally would change the complexion of the United States, change the economy and the society of the United States. And it's one that we've been building up to over the last few weeks, right, with our discussion going back 3 weeks to Manifest Destiny and the conflicts over Western expansion. But generally speaking, the growing conflict between pro-slavery and anti-slavery. In the video chat from last week, video lecture, not chat, but from last week, culminated in the election of 1860, right? The election of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency in November of 1860. And as I said at the very end of that last week's talk, this triggered the so-called secession movement, SECESSION, the secession movement. The secession, the domino effect of slave states, first beginning in the so-called New South, the Cotton Kingdom, which was the subject of a reading and video lecture from about a month ago. States including South Carolina, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and eventually upper South or old Southern states of Virginia, most importantly, but also Kentucky, or Tennessee, excuse me, would leave the United States to form a separate nation, a nation that they called the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy, which is what I'll refer to it as, which is what most people refer to it as. And this is a process, secession. If you have the Civil War slideshow that's posted on Blackboard, this is referring to a slide called Creating the Confederacy. It was a movement that happened over the course of 5 months. And if you look under the first dot, secession, you can see that's December of 1860 to May of 1861. And the two-letter abbreviations are for the states that would leave the United States to join the Confederacy in order. The Confederate States of America was very clear, the leaders of the Confederate States of America were very clear about why they did what they did, why they left the United States. We see this in the Confederate States of America's Constitution, which states the matter very clearly. We are seceding from the United States. We are creating our own separate nation. First, most importantly, to protect the institution of slavery. What was the threat? The threat was that the president-elect, Abraham Lincoln, as a Republican who held anti-slavery beliefs, might possibly act to undermine slavery in the southern states, and in order to protect it, these states seceded to form their own country, again, the Confederacy. And so the main point of today's talk, and I won't talk about every single slide that you have under the Civil War slideshow, but the main point of today is to talk about the Civil War as a war over slavery, a war from the perspective of the Union, the free states of the North, to emancipate slaves, and from the perspective of the Confederacy, a war to protect and preserve the institution of slavery. And this is a point that's worth emphasizing, and which I will do throughout the course of this talk today, in part because it's a contention that continues to exist today, that the Civil War wasn't really about slavery. It was about other issues, and slavery is or was a relatively insignificant part of the reasons why the Confederacy was created and why a 4-year Civil War, which ended up with 1 million people dying, occurred. And you still see it today, by the way. You see it in modern day Southern conservatives. They continue to repeat it. Contention that the Civil War happened because of states' rights. Perhaps you've heard that the Confederate states seceded from the United States to protect their states' rights, and that slavery was relatively insignificant. That's incorrect. You also hear it from the Northern perspective, right, that the reason the Union engaged in a war against the Confederacy was because they wanted to preserve the United States as it existed before the Civil War. They wanted to only bring back the states that left to form the Confederacy. When the reality is that when we look at the Civil War from the perspective of the president, Abraham Lincoln, the Civil War was in fact a war to emancipate slaves from the very beginning. And a point, again, this is a point I'm going to belabor because that is the only way we can make sense of the events of the war. And I'm not going to talk too much about the military aspects of the war itself, though it's interesting for reasons of time. I will say that if you scroll down to this slide that's entitled Measuring the Sides, a couple of points to note is that each side, the Union, the Free States of the North, and the Confederacy, had different advantages and therefore disadvantages. In general terms, the Union, the Free States of the North, had extremely overwhelmingly objective advantages, which is to say advantages that could be easily measured. If you look at the point population, the Union had a much larger sheer number of people, 22.5 million to 9.7 million. One thing to note is that of the 9.7 million population of the Confederate States, 4 million of those were slaves who did not fight during the Civil War against the Union. So in reality, the population advantage was 22 million to 4.8 million, which is significant, or 5.8 million, excuse me, significant. The Union had significant advantages in industry, industrial capacity, had financial advantages that were tremendous, had transportation advantages. These are all things that, again, can be measured. In terms of industry, for example, just to give you one, the Union states had contained 80% of the industrial capacity of the United States before the Civil War. Capacity to produce through industrialization processes, uniforms, guns, ammunition, all of the war material that a country needs to fight a war. In finance, the Union had 90% of the bank capital, money deposited in banks in the United States before the Civil War. So that's even easier to understand, that literally the Union had more money, had a much larger financial advantage than the Confederacy had. The Confederate advantages were more subjective, less easy to measure directly, but still significant, especially early in the Civil War. The Confederacy had an advantage in military experience in terms of the ranks of officers. The Confederacy, over the course of the war, had a significant so-called home field advantage. Much of the war was fought in Confederate territory. Therefore, the Confederates were able to use that to their advantage, again, especially in the early years of the war. The Confederacy, early in 1861, 1862, and 1863, had a significant morale advantage. They saw themselves as fighting for their own independence, just as the North American colonists had fought for their independence before or during the American Revolution, and that's how Confederates sort of viewed themselves. So they had a morale advantage. And these advantages, if you scroll down to the next slide called strategies, were manifested in strategies. Because the Union had tremendous objective advantages. Their first strategy, their grand strategy to beat the Confederacy was called the Anaconda Plan. And actually, if you can go to American Yawp chapter 14 and scroll down to section 3, you can see a map called Scott, which refers to the Union's first commanding general, Union Army's first commanding general, Scott's Great Snake, which is the anaconda. If you're not familiar with an anaconda, they kill their prey by strangling them. And that's the plan that the Union first had, which you can see in this map, the big snake that goes around the coast down under Florida and then along the Gulf of Mexico. And then metaphorically, and in the case of this map, literally snaking up to the Mississippi River. The plan was to strangle the Confederacy using a method called blockading, blocking using the Union's Navy, the Confederacy's ability to import and export items, a major component of the plan, sealing off the Confederacy again from exports. And this plan, the so-called Anaconda Plan, ultimately was successful. It was a plan, however, that was a slow-moving plan. It made the Civil War what military historians call a war of attrition, right? A slowly developing war that would be won ultimately not by a significant major battle, but by a collection of smaller battles cumulatively being fought that slowly weakened the Confederacy, which is in fact what happened ultimately. But this strategy made the war much longer than many had hoped it would be. The Confederate strategy is a sort of mirror image of that. Their plan was to fight defensively and not to take too many risks in terms of engaging in major battles, but using selective, quick frontal attacks in order to surprise the Union Army, which again had tremendous objective advantages. And this strategy, these primarily defensive but punctuated with quick frontal attacks, is most apparent in the battle that I think it's fair to say is the most famous battle of the Civil War, the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863, actually fought in Pennsylvania. If you've ever been to Gettysburg, you could see the battlefields themselves. This was the best example of the Confederacy's overall strategy. We'll primarily play defense, but will attempt again to achieve quick victories, surprising the Union. And the goal of these tactics, defensive tactics, quick frontal attacks, was to discourage the Northern public's morale, their support for the war, hoping that the Union Army would give up and recognize the Confederacy as an independent country. And so, like I said, that's as much as I'll talk about the military aspects of the war. What I really want to focus on is talk about the meaning of the war, which you can see on a slide. It's called The Meaning of the War, or had we been meeting in class and discussed Radical and the Republican, this would have been relevant to that, but of course we're not reading it because of the pandemic and the difficulties of doing remote learning. But the meaning of the war refers to the fact that, as I said at the outset, is that the Civil War was about slavery. It was about emancipating slaves from the perspective of the Union. It was about preserving slavery from the perspective of the Confederacy. And so the subject of this slide is to look at the war from the Union perspective as a war for emancipation. The standard narrative that you've probably learned if you learned about the Civil War in high school, it's one that is still widely accepted, not just in schools or in academia, but in terms of the general public's knowledge of the Civil War, is that from the perspective of the Union, the primary goal, and this is the first point on the slide called The Meaning of the War, was to preserve the Union, meaning bring back the states that seceded to form the Confederacy, to make again the United States whole, as it had existed before 1860, and then secondarily to emancipate slaves. So the war began as a war for union and has shifted to become a war for emancipation. And I think that's incorrect, because I think that it was both a war to preserve the Union, but also a war to emancipate slaves from the very beginning. And the reason I believe this, and other scholars who agree with me believe this, is because this is what makes sense of the policies that Abraham Lincoln, as the president and commander-in-chief, and the Union, the United States Congress, led by Lincoln's fellow Republicans, the policies that they imposed with reference to slaves and the institution of slavery from the very beginning of the war. And this policy is called contraband policy. And so contraband means, in this context, it's a legal term to describe when in a time of war, the combatants in a war can take each other's property as a strategy for helping to win that war. And the property that you take from your opponent in a war is called contraband property. And this idea is not unique to the Civil War. In every war, contraband property is taken by the combatants. It's a standard accepted part of war, right? When you're fighting somebody, you can take their land, their real estate property. You can possess their buildings. You can take your opponent's military equipment, just to name a couple of examples. And so this, again, is something that had existed long before the Civil War, this idea of contraband property, and continues to exist today. In every war it exists. What made the United States Civil War unique is that the contraband property that was most important was enslaved people themselves, owned by the Confederate States, the slaveholders of the Confederacy. And again, remembering that slaves were held as the private property of slaveholders. So this is a unique kind of property, most importantly because enslaved people are human beings who can think and reason. And one of the biggest issues facing the Union at the very beginning of the war is the fact that slaves, from the very earliest stages of the war, from the Confederate States began to run away, and they would run to the Union Army because they believed that running away to the Union Army would lead them to freedom. So the question became, what was the Union Army? What were Union Army generals, officers, and just regular enlisted soldiers supposed to do in a scenario in which slaves ran to them? Slaves were technically contraband property because they were held as the property of Confederate slaveholders. The question is, what was supposed to happen to them? And this is where contraband policy becomes the origins of emancipation. There were several options available before the Confiscation Acts were passed to Union Army generals, officers, and enlisted men. One was to accept slaves who ran into their ranks and keep them. Another was to refuse to allow them to remain with the Union Army, say, go back to your slaveholder. We don't want you, we can't support you. And so the Confiscation Acts, the two of them, the first one in August of 1861 and July of 1862, were intended to provide clarity to the Union armies as they slowly began to invade the Confederate States, again, as part of this Anaconda plan that we just discussed. Because the question was, if we keep these slaves, these contraband slaves who run away to us, are they free or are they not free? What is their legal status? And so the first Confiscation Act, again, August of 1861, declared that any slave who ran away from slavery to the Union Army, who it could be proven was owned by a family whose members either fought as soldiers for the Confederacy, or any slave whose family was owned by who was owned by a family who had members that served in the Confederate government. So you either had to be, as a slave, be owned by a family who had members fighting, or owned by a family which had members serving in the Confederate government. In that case, those slaves would be freed forever. They would not be sent back to slavery, they would be freed. Why? Because a concern that Abraham Lincoln had was that simply freeing all slaves that came to the Union Army would lead to a scenario in which slaves ran away from masters who were actually loyal to the Union, and therefore would be tantamount to the Union Army and President Lincoln freeing slaves from loyal American citizens. So this is a limited emancipation. This was not sufficient, however, and in July of 1862, we have the Second Confiscation Act, which declared that slaves who were owned by anybody who was sympathetic to the Confederacy, anybody who in any way supported the Confederacy, their slaves would be freed if they ran away to the Union Army. So it's a little bit more broad. However, both of these acts, in addition to the Emancipation Proclamation, which I'll discuss in a second, only applied to slaves who were owned by slaveholders in the states that seceded to form the Confederacy. This left out slaves who were owned by owners who lived in states which had not joined the Confederacy. These were called the border states. And this is significant because there were 4 states where slavery was legal that did not join the Confederacy. These were Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware. States which technically remained a part of the Union, the United States, yet states were which also had made slavery legal, in which slavery was legal. So these border states presented a different question. And Abraham Lincoln's first idea was to try to convince these states to abolish slavery voluntarily by offering money to slaveholders in exchange for freeing or emancipating their slaves. This is called compensated emancipation. In effect, saying to first, the case of Delaware, a very small state with a small slave population, Abraham Lincoln offered federal government money, like literally cash payouts, to slaveholders if they would submit to their slaves being emancipated. Why? To compensate them for the loss of property, meaning the loss of the value of an enslaved person being made free. And from our perspective in the 21st century, we might wonder if that was a morally upstanding idea, right? Should the government pay slaveholders to allow their slaves to be emancipated? You might wonder, well, why weren't the slaves compensated? Which is a separate set of questions. But this was thought to be a reasonable solution from the perspective of Abraham Lincoln, except for the fact that it failed. Even slaveholders in the tiny state Delaware refused this. So I want to just keep that in mind as we finish up on the final slide of this lecture, because this is what helps explain the creation of the 13th Amendment at the end of the war. All of this happens, the development of contraband policy, again, the origins of emancipation, the first 2 confiscation acts, the failure of compensated emancipation, all of it before the Emancipation Proclamation, which is likely familiar to many, if not all of you, and is usually seen as the first attempt by Abraham Lincoln to free slaves. It's actually the 4th. And that's something that is misunderstood by the sort of general American public, right? Usually we see the Emancipation Proclamation as a massive turning point. Oh, Abraham Lincoln has decided that slaves should be freed. When in fact it was a good way to think about it, the way I prefer to think about it, is the 3rd Confiscation Act. Because while the Emancipation Proclamation is obviously an important document, an important policy in American history, was actually relatively limited, and as I said, it's better understood as the Third Confiscation Act. Why? The Emancipation Proclamation built on the first two confiscation acts, in effect said that from this point forward, from January the 1st, 1863 forward, anytime the Union Army encounters slaves anywhere in the Confederate States, they'll be freed, no matter who their owner was or what their owner's sympathies were towards the Confederacy. Doesn't matter. When the Union Army is in Confederate territory and they encounter slaves, they will free them. Period. End of discussion. So again, it's really a third step, not a massive innovation. It's not to say it's unimportant. It was clearly important. But there are a couple of caveats. Right? This only applied to the Confederate states. This did not apply to the border states. And most importantly, Abraham Lincoln making this proclamation didn't automatically free all the slaves in the Confederacy. It was only effective where the Union Army could take possession of slaves to free them. And the best estimates that we have, historians have, are that of the slave 4 million members of the slave population in the Confederate States, ultimately the Emancipation Proclamation freed about 800,000 of them. So that's about 20% of the Confederate slave population was freed because of the first two confiscation acts and then the Emancipation Proclamation. That's a lot of freed slaves, but that it meant that 80% of the Confederate slave population was in fact still in slavery when the Civil War ended. And I want to get to that now and scroll down, skip the two slides after the meaning of the war slide and just get down to Union triumph, Confederate surrender. So this will be the last slide of the semester. The war, for reasons that, again, I'm not going to discuss in too much detail. You can read about them in chapter 14 of American Yop, but in particular in section 4 and section 5. Let's get back to the slide. By the opening months of 1865, it's about 4 years into the war, it seemed clear that the Union was going to win the war. The Anaconda plan, the strategy to, metaphorically, but also literally strangle the Confederacy really began to take a toll by 1865. And in April 8th that year, at the courthouse at Appomattox, Virginia, Robert E. Lee, the commanding general of the Confederate forces, famously surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant, the commanding general of the Union forces. And so this is traditionally seen as the end of the Civil War, although actually, of course, all the way over in Texas, fighting continued for a couple of months, actually. But the official end is usually stated as April 8th, 1865. But again, the end of the war, official end of the war, that is to say, at Appomattox Courthouse, at that moment, 80% of the slave population of the Confederacy still technically remained in slavery. And so the question was, from the perspective of Abraham Lincoln, how do we officially, not just militarily, but end the conflict between the Union and the Confederacy while ensuring that slavery will forever be abolished? From the perspective of Lincoln, what good would it have been to have fought a war for 4 years, which led to, again, 1 million deaths, a war for emancipation, without actually emancipating, freeing all of the slaves of the Confederacy? And so Lincoln was thinking through how to achieve this, and he had settled on trying to secure a constitutional amendment, what is today the 13th Amendment, as the solution. Right? The only way that we can ensure that the war will formally end and slavery will end with it is to change the United States Constitution before the former Confederate states which by that point had surrendered, could be brought back into the United States. We're not bringing back any slave states. Why? Because we're abolishing slavery through the 13th Amendment. And unfortunately for President Lincoln, he did not live to see that day. He was famously assassinated 1 week after the war ended on April 15th, 1865. You're likely familiar with this, but by a man named John Wilkes Booth, who walked up behind him and shot him in the back of the head. So Abraham Lincoln died before the 13th Amendment was passed, and it actually wasn't passed for 8 months after his death in December of 1865. The 13th Amendment, which abolished chattel slavery and involuntary servitude. The intention being we are forever abolishing slavery in the United States. So this is the sort of proper end of this class, the end of the Civil War. We began all the way early in the colonial period with the late 16th century, if you remember, going all the way back to the second day of class. And it's been very much an up and down semester, but here we are at the end. If you are taking History 104, or if you've already taken it before, you'll know, or you will find out, as the case may be, that that class, the second half of American history, begins with the period of Reconstruction, where we see what is usually referred to as America's unfinished revolution unfold, with constitutional amendments, 14th and 15th Amendments, to secure civil and political and voting rights for freed people. We see Black political participation, but ultimately the creation of the Jim Crow South. So these are all topics that would be discussed in History 104. But I'll sign off there for now. This is the last video lecture. So I'll say that it's been a pleasure to be with you this semester, even though it's been one of tremendous upheaval. But email me again if you have any questions, and next week you'll be able to see your grades on Blackboard. I'm going to put one more discussion post up that you'll need to reply to by next Wednesday, which is May the 20th, and then that'll be it for this class. Okay. So again, let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you sometime if we ever get to go back on campus. Okay.